Okay, so I just recorded this video and my computer lost it. I don't know why. Probably because this program's a little bit buggy. Anyway, restart. Yay. So I'm discussing today the bank bailouts and why they're necessary to the capitalist system. And rather than using figures and stuff this time, I'm going to argue from history because I have a lot of historical knowledge of the Western world. Anyway, this is going to be a bit more abbreviated than the last one, which was over 20 minutes. Okay, moving along. Let's rewind time to the 1200s, to the birth of capitalism as we know it. In other words, Florence, Italy, 1200s, with the rise of the great names in banking. The first notable banking family was the Fugger family, Ugger. I'm sure that will get some crude comments. Anyway, the Fugger family, first major banks. Yay. They were valued in the hundreds of millions of dollars at their peak. They didn't make it to the end, but they were very early game players. And they kind of created the idea of a bank as we know it now. So let's be clear on something. Capitalism requires banks. It is named for them, the moving of capital from one group of people to another. Capitalism. Capital being money and liquid assets. So, we're moving capital back and forth in this system, and we're dealing with banks because that's what moves capital back and forth. The original banks were intended to minimize risk. It's what they've always been about. Initially, to start an entrepreneurial adventure, to explore, to start a new business, etc., you needed capital. You needed something to get you started, money, right? Even today, we need this. So, the idea of a bank was that several people would pool their money together and invest in this venture. And then, if it took off and did well, they all profited a little. If it didn't take off and it flopped, they lost, but it wasn't a devastating loss. They didn't put so much into it that it would destroy them, right? This was the idea. What happened to it is that people also began to see it as simpler, as an easy. So these are the original loans, right? And they come through a middleman from a group of people to one person. It's a loan. And you always risk that the person was going to default on the loan, that they would flop. Now, banks became easy storage for money for people who didn't mind them being invested in these ventures. What happened is that capital started to be stored in the banks. They took care of it, they guaranteed its safety, they even paid you interest on it. Why did they pay you interest on it? Because they were charging interest on those loans that they gave you, and they were charging more interest on the loans than they were giving you on your savings. And yes, this is the way banks operate. This is how they make a profit. A highly successful idea, took off, did well. People start using banks, banknotes to say, I want to give X amount of money to someone else. The predecessor to modern day checks. Very successful. Worked very well. And a famous banking family that did make it through to the end, that was very much involved in the end game results, were the De Medici family. So I'm not going to talk about them specifically too much, but you've probably heard of the De Medici family. In the end, they were valued at their height. They were valued in billions. Um, they were in today's money. They were very good at what they did, very prosperous, very famous. Yeah, history's filled with De Medicis. Anyway, we the system from here towards the 1400s, really before then, but towards the 1400s it became a big thing. Late 13, early 1400s. The banks started lending to England, France, and Spain. Now, if you know anything about Western history, you know that England, France, and Spain were constantly at war in the Middle Ages. They were fighting each other. England would fight France, France would fight Spain, Spain would fight England. They were constantly fighting each other. War requires capital. You have to buy armor, you have to buy weapons, you have to buy Lord's allegiance. You have to pay your soldiers in some form. At the very least, you have to feed them. Dead soldiers don't do much. Starving soldiers aren't much use either. So what happens is they need the money and they don't have it. They need money to continue the wars. They don't have it. What do? They go to the banks and they say, Italian banks, you're doing so well. Look at all the money you have. You have way more money than you could ever loan out to a bunch of entrepreneurs. And the banks say, well, yes, this is very true, and they get very proud of themselves. And so the countries are like, can't you loan us money for your war? And the banks go, our war? And the banks go, absolutely, we can. And in fact, let's give you a special interest rate deal. Because do you know what they're thinking? Interest rate is a percentage. And if they borrow a lot of money, we're going to make a lot of money back on that interest. So they agree to loan out the money to England, France, and Spain. And in the late 1400s, England, France, and Spain do something unexpected. But it should have been expected. They default on their loans, all at once. Boom! Within a decade, they default of each other. They default on their loans. Now, the banking system could have handled one of them defaulting. It might have survived two of them defaulting. All three of them literally destroyed the system. The banks went under. Now you're like, they deserved it. They were crooks. They were, gambling with other people's money. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, maybe the banks deserve to go under. But do you know who they dragged with them? They dragged everyone with them. They dragged the entire city, arguably the entire country of Italy, down with them. Anyone who had money in the banks was in danger, and many of them did, lose it. It was gone. It wasn't there. The banks couldn't give it back to you because they didn't have it. Oh, yeah, it hurts the normal people too when the banks go under. Banks don't have the money, they can't pay the normal people back, everything goes to hell. Fast forward to the modern age. We are in a global recession. We're recovering, and some countries have already recovered, and some are less recovered than others. Right? But right now we're kind of in a global recession towards the end of it, we hope. At the beginning of the global recession, the government did something unpopular under both Bush and Obama, which was to bail out the banks. The banks were going under. They were collapsing. Why were they collapsing? Well, they had given out a bunch of loans to people who probably should not have gotten loans in the first place. Well, these people who should not have gotten loans in the first place defaulted. Okay, the bank can survive those defaults to an extent. But now we're in an economic recession. The housing market collapses. People default on their home loans, which, by the way, are your biggest loans normally. Bam! More money. As the recession picks up speed because more and more people are defaulting on their loans, which means there's less and less capital. Do you see how this is causing itself to snowball over? The more people who default on their loans, the less capital there is. The less capital there is for the banks to move around, the less the entrepreneurs get. The less the entrepreneurs get, the fewer jobs are created. Now companies have to start tightening the purse strings and they lay people off. Now more people can't pay back their loan and default. And it snowballs. Right, so now you understand some basic economics, we hope. Anyway, the snowball effect caused not just the banks to go under, although that too. It started causing the normal people to go under. So the Congress did something very unpopular. They bailed them out. And everyone said, oh my god, how dare you bail out those sick, greedy bastards that are just looking to make money off everyone and blah, blah, blah. And you're right, they were. They were. They're greedy, but so are you. I guarantee if you had a chance to make a profit, most of you would. So we bailed out the sick, greedy bastards, and we avoided the problem of Florence, of Italy. Now the banks are stabilized. People do not go under. They don't lose their life savings. I'm going to hazard a bet that almost everyone watching this video uses a bank somehow. Either you have a savings account, most people do. You may have a money market. You possibly have a safe. You very, very likely use some form of credit, whether it be a credit card, your loans on your house and cars, those sorts of credit. I can guarantee that the vast majority of people utilize a bank in some regard. If the banks go under, the normal people go under with it. You lose your savings. People don't seem to understand this. If the banks collapse, you lose what's in them. The government did the only thing it could to keep the system from collapsing. It made sure the banks didn't go under. You're going to say, it should have kicked out the people at top. Maybe it should have. Maybe it should have changed the management. But the fact of the matter is, the bank bailouts were all that the government could do if they wanted to remain a capitalist system. In fact, had nature taken its course, as Marx predicted, we would no longer have a capitalist system. We wouldn't normally have a communist one, but we wouldn't have a capitalist system. Capitalism has evolved, and John Maynard Keynes did an excellent job in making sure it evolved in a way that survived, for better or for worse. I know all the conservatives are going to yell at me about how Keynesian economics doesn't work. Keynesian economics works very well in a capitalist system if you use it properly. Most people do not. That aside, I don't care for Keynes myself either. I'd rather, instead of fixing capitalism, we replaced it, but no, that didn't happen. Anyway, capitalism can evolve to an extent, but what you've got to understand is that the banking problem is inherent to capitalism. There's no if, but, or maybe about it. The banks have to be there. It can't evolve beyond having banks. They're the support grid of the system. So, what can we do? We have to have banks. We could evolve in such a way that there's never a recession, right? Wrong. Capitalism requires exponential growth. What goes up must come down. You can't grow forever. So you have to have times of hardship so you can have times of plenty in a capitalist system. That's how it works. So I guess that concludes this video. Leave your comments in the section below. Blah, blah, blah. Peace.